Nada muda mais depressa do que o passado, e os historiadores, esses profissionais que se ocupam do passado, estão sendo acusados hoje de saberem cada vez mais sobre menos coisas. Esse tipo de crítica evidentemente não se aplica a um intelectual, pensador e historiador como o inglês Eric Hobsbawm. Ele ficou famoso abordando não só eventos ou períodos, mas eras, que se estendem por muitos séculos. Hobsbawm é o mestre da análise global, recheada de detalhes saborosos, observações irônicas e conclusões brilhantes. O último livro de Hobsbawm ficou bastante conhecido no Brasil. É a história do século XX, o mais curto de todos, diz Hobsbawm, e um século que já acabou.
Professor Hobsbawm, why should we ask historians questions about the future?
Well, there's a continuum between the past, the present and the future. So what happened in the past, what is happening now, which will be the past in 2 minutes' time, must have a bearing on the future. Those of us who specialize in finding out how we got to be where we are now, what we say must be relevant to what's going to happen. That doesn't mean that we are prophets, but it means that it makes sense to ask us about the future.
One of your colleagues used to say that historians, like a camera, always lie because they catch a point which is two-dimensional, and it's very hard from the historical viewpoint to predict what will going to happen, taking in consideration what is happening now. Do you do any comment on this?
You can't predict simply because it's only in retrospect that you know what actually happened. In prospect, you can say some things are more likely than other things, but there are so many things you don't know. What you can say is what the situation is, how it's become like that, what the problems are, in some sense, if you like, what the decisions are that have to be taken if they're subject to decisions. But to forecast is a completely different activity, and I'm happy to say that as historians we are not committed to it. The only horse races which we can tip are the ones which have already been run.
Well, some people say nothing changed more than the past, and historians looking into the past are important too in the hands of governments who are trying to rewrite history in their political sense, in day-by-day political sense. History is so important in nationalistic movements in Europe today. That's not surprising for you, is it?
No, that unfortunately is not the kind of history which most professional historians write. In a way, 100 years, more than 100 years ago, it was said by a great scholar that getting your history wrong or forgetting your history is part of becoming a nation, because nations are quite modern phenomena which pretend that they've been there all the time. Now, this can't be the case in Latin America because Brazil knows it hasn't been there all the time. It's only been there since the 16th century. But in Europe and in Asia, you can easily pretend that something that is quite new, like Pakistan, which is just 50 years old, in some ways goes back to the earliest civilizations in the Indus Valley. Sometimes, if you don't have a sufficiently adequate history, you invent it. This is harder today.
Do you have any particular example in mind when you say that they invented? Could you please tell us?
There's a number of things. Up to the 19th century, you find people actually making up great historic documents of the Middle Ages, proving that whatever it is, some great cultural tradition was being practiced. It was done quite heavily in the 18th century particularly. You can't do it today, but what you can do is being anachronistic and reading things into the past which don't really have no bearing to it.
It means less history is better for present governments than too much history?
There's always quite a lot of history. I mean, even relatively young countries. I mean, the United States, for instance, which in quantitative terms has less history than England. But they've got plenty of history to construct themselves a real or a constructive past. On the other hand, it is probably easier if you don't, I mean, if the load of the past which rests on a particular country is not that great. If you look at the Greeks, for instance, at the moment, they would be better off if they could really remember that modern Greece is something which started in the early 19th century, and what happened in the days of Pericles. There isn't a continuity between that and then.
And you wrote in your book, which is so popular in Brazil, that the irony is that this neoliberalism has triumphed at the very moment when it ceased to be as plausible as it had once seemed. Do you see any future for these types of economic regimes we have and apparently are praised now by the big powers as the solution for every mankind's problems?
Frankly, I don't see any future for the ultra-liberal regimes, because it seemed to me that while they may undoubtedly, speaking globally, produce a very rapid rate of growth, they multiply social and political problems, both within country and internationally, I believe probably to a greater extent. I believe, and in this I think I share the view of a number of economists, say 20, 30 years ago, people like Samuelson, that the really major success of the capitalist economy is precisely when it became a mixed economy instead of a mixed economy, when it succeeded both in getting extreme economic growth and in diminishing social inequities to some extent. At the moment,
this is what we would call the welfare state.
Well, the welfare state was partly a necessary complement to this kind of thing, and partly, of course, it was made possible by this semi-managed development. The present situation seems to me to be one-sided, and therefore to, as it were, leave out the human and, to this extent, to some extent, the political side. I think that's a really big problem. It will have to be tackled one way or another. At the moment, people don't tackle it, at least in the developed countries, because they say, well, most people in the developed countries are better off. The ones that are worse off are a minority, big minority, but still a minority. They're not very well organized. The kind of movements which used to organize them are in disarray, so we don't have to pay too much attention to them. And if the worst come to the worst, as in the United States, we can always put them in jail and employ the ones that can't get jobs as jailers.
Do you think that national governments faced with these sort of transnational economic streams are still in the position to decide anything?
Yes, they are. The fact is, ideologists and even a lot of politicians and scientists always tend to go in for extreme either-or situations. Either one thing is triumphant or it doesn't exist. In fact, what we have today is clearly a globalized economy which is independent of states.
That's right.
And is obviously affects them and particularly weakens them to some extent. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that the states have ceased to exist or can be dispensed with. For instance, the fact is that 3/4 of the human race, 75%, still live in 25 states, big states of 50 million and over. Now, it would be absurd to believe that these 25 states alone or together are incapable of affecting what happens in the world economy. Again, you can see that to some extent the world economy is subject to pressures which it can't do anything about, and these questions these pressures are political pressures. For instance, if I may say so, ideally speaking, according to all these economics gurus, you must have complete freedom, freedom of trade, freedom of movement, freedom of anything, and the ideal world economy is one in which there is no obstacle at all to this. Now, in fact, this has been largely achieved with one major exception. There is no freedom of movement for labor, no freedom of migration. On paper, this is just as an essential an element to complete the free global economy. And yet, it can't be achieved. The political obstacles, you can see this in Europe, which is building more iron curtains around itself.
Is
to prevent
the fortress Europe now.
Fortress Europe. You can even see it in the United States, which for 20 years actually encouraged or did not impose obstacles to mass immigration. Now they're once again beginning to do so.
In general theoretical terms, are there any theory today which, in your opinion, would help us try to understand what are the forces behind historical movements, since in a way the way that the dialect of Marxism or dialect materialism was used by the socialist countries has discredited this type of undertaking?
So I think essentially the basic historical approach still is the best, the one which goes back to Marx and to other people, not only to Marx at this time. If you don't wish to come to Marx's answers, you must ask his questions. And I think you'll find even in the last 20 years or so, serious both economists, sociologists and others who have tried to look at it have found themselves asking these questions and answering them in those terms. I mean, I think so, for instance, the late Ernest Gellner, who at once said, I'm not a Marxist, I'm an anti-Marxist, but I realize that if you are going to try and see what has been happening in history, you've got to start off in some way by looking at the way in which people earn their living, or various other people have come to similar conclusions.
Do you would like to take the risk to make any forecast about the position Brazil's in the international relationships and the importance of this country in the foreseeable future?
Well, I wouldn't like to take the risk, and I don't think I would be qualified to do it. But still, I mean, one can say a number of things about Brazil. First, I don't believe that it is necessary to assume that there will be an explosion in Brazil. I mean, there are a certain number of countries in which you can say it is likely that something like this happens, but when this is so, it is not necessarily only because of the tensions created by a particular phase of economic development. Political and other issues which make things more acute, if you like. I'm not saying that these things cannot occur. We've had some pretty major revolutions in the past 20 years, after all, you know, the Iranian one. But I don't think it is necessary to assume that this, there are all manner of forms of rapid change, historic change, of which this happens to be only one, and not necessarily the most characteristic. I think it's clear that Brazil will remain, and must remain, if you like, the major economy in South America, at all events, in that particular. And to the extent that it's certainly one of the bigger ones of these 25 countries in which most of humanity lives, it must play an important role. Socially, economically, in international trade, more so than in international politics, because it happens to be in a particular region in which, if you like, the options of international politics are very restricted. Partly because there isn't very much around, and partly because, I mean, it's part of the Western Hemisphere in which effectively the overwhelming influence of the United States is something which everybody has to take.
Doesn't mean that Brazil will live under the shadow of the United States, is it?
No, I don't think Brazil has ever lived under the shadow of the United States, even in the days when Brazil was closer to the United States, for instance, because it wished to set itself off against Argentina or something like this. No, I mean, these are countries which are... Brazil, while, for instance, in economic terms, it must take account of and may well find itself drifting into too much dependency, say, on the dollar, I doubt whether Brazil is as vulnerable, even now, as, say, Mexico is. For one thing, Mexico is a lot nearer, and what is more, Mexico has, if you like, depends for its own internal stability, economic and otherwise, so much on mass migration to the USA. There's no equivalent, I think, in Brazil. Nevertheless, I think Brazil's, so to speak, international options are much limited. It will be an important regional power, and no doubt as part of global arrangements, it will play a part, and quite an important part. But on its economic developments, I mean, they have been enormous, because after all, Brazil is, what is it, the seventh largest economy?
The seventh largest economy.
But remember,
since last December.
Since last December, remember, it was that once before already. Brazil is a country which has always had enormous potential, and so far it has very rarely got quite to realize quite the potential which was in there. Why this is so, I don't know. I mean, I strongly suspect that the extraordinary inequalities, social inequalities in Brazil, have to some extent limited the potential even of its economic growth. Whereas, I tried to point this out in my book, in the Far East, in Japan and Korea and other things, one of the great assets they had in enabling themselves to go is precisely a degree of relative, well, I won't say equality, but of less inequality than is at all usual in most other countries. I suspect that may be something that has so far limited the potential of Brazil, where, of course, inequality is dramatic.
I'm sure you were confronted several times as a historian and as a thinker with the very old question, which is actually the role of personality in history. In the case of Brazil, we have a powerful intellect as a Brazilian president. How important could be an individual in historical process, like in Brazil?
Well, it's always a good thing to have an intelligent man and an intellectual in charge of a country in important things, provided he's also a good politician. This is not always the case. But nevertheless, other things being equal, and I think you're lucky, because Fernando Henrique is a highly respected, intellectual, internationally respected, and he's a very bright man. I mean, intellectually, he's pretty smart by any standards. And I think you're lucky also in living in a country in which this is still regarded as to some extent a political asset. In the United States, it would not be regarded as a political asset to have been a distinguished sociologist if you become a candidate for the presidency. But in Brazil, it still is. And that helps. So I think that is positive. The role of individuals does depend on the situation. I mean, in certain situations they can, of course, be enormous, absolutely crucial. The 20th century is full of situations in which a particular individual, Hitler, Lenin, did make a dramatic difference, but you cannot talk about this in general terms.
Mm-hmm.
It's possible to imagine situations even in Russian history or in German history in which somebody like Lenin and Hitler would not have been able to make much difference. It's a situation, particular situation. Whether the situation in Brazil is one which allows the president at the moment to have this potential effect, that is a thing which I can't judge. I would say probably not. But that doesn't mean that he can't make a contribution, and possibly a lasting contribution and an important contribution, which wouldn't have been made if a different president had been elected.
The very last question. Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and perhaps Chile, they have formed a sort of common market. Mercosur is more than a common market. It's even an attempt to face other important common economic areas with some degree of political common decision. Is this only in your view, is this only a reaction to what happened in other parts of the world, or this would be the only chance for countries like Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay to face the cold and strong winds that are coming from powerful regions like Asia, Europe, and the United States?
Well, you can say any attempt to set up large-scale common markets in American countries has been, is an old aim. The failure to coordinate, or to coordinate, even to coordinate policies, has had tremendously bad results. Most recently in the early 80s, when the failure of Brazil and Mexico and Argentina to coordinate their policy over debts was undoubtedly bad for all three of them, you know. And so it seems to me a logical development and one to be greatly welcomed.
Down to the very last, when I read your book 2 years ago, I was struck by your very last sentence, which was that our world risks both explosion and implosion. It must change. The price of failure is darkness. At that time I asked you, almost 2 years ago, whether that was not too pessimistic. And I repeat the question. Is it, in your opinion, pessimistic? Anything has changed since you finished writing your book? That book, I mean.
I don't think there have been any dramatic changes since then. You can say that there have been hopeful signs and less hopeful signs. For instance, it's clear that there are considerably, I mean, when I finished my book, I was actually expecting in the world economy to go not only to expand, but to enter a new phase of rapid and flourishing expansion. And my prediction, my pessimistic prediction, was not that there would be a breakdown in the world economy, but that the social and political problems arising out of the new situation would, in the end, produce extremely dangerous and negative results. Well, I think this is still so. I think, to some extent, the situation, if you like, is more dangerous. I believe, for instance, that the idea of transforming the labor market and abolishing the welfare state is no solution for anything, and it creates problems which will be increasingly difficult to solve. I believe that similar problems are likely to arise even in countries which have been economically unusually successful. You can actually begin to see them arising at this very moment in Korea.
Mm-hmm.
See, well, which is probably the most spectacular example of a country undergoing rapid economic, cultural, and indeed political development within a very short period. And even there, we now find ourselves in the new situation faced, which was clearly the beginning of a very troublesome crisis. So I maintain my belief that if, in a sense, the present tendencies, which are essentially those of a neoliberal development, don't change, the results are likely to be very unsatisfactory. What form it's going to take is another thing, but let me just say one thing at the end. One always assumes that if people make pessimistic predictions, they're thinking of some kind of cataclysm, like an earthquake or a volcanic eruption. But the real danger to the world, I'd say this as a historian, is what you might say slow motion catastrophes, not immediate eruptions. And these can be quite, in the long term, quite as destructive, for instance, of the fabric of society than the more dramatic eruptions and explosions.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.